Okay, a couple of things before we get started. One, tomorrow is a holiday. I'm pretty sure you guys know that already and have made plans to not be anywhere. And so there'll be no quiz tomorrow on Wednesday. I'm not going to have a quiz up for you. We have class Thursday, but it won't be anything that I'm going to be covering that you need a quiz to prep for. The second thing is, in the last 2 weeks, the last 4 quizzes, there have been a lot of people who just didn't take them. Now, everything got extended, and a lot of people took the extensions because of the power outages and the internet down and everything else, and they finished them up. But some people didn't do anything, and as a result, as I was working out the grades this weekend, we had some individuals who went from having like an 89 and just one quiz away or one turn-in project away from going up to an A, and by the end of the weekend they were down to an 82. And they weren't the only one to be dropping. We had some people drop into C and some people drop into D. So I suggest you take a look. Everything got extended. If you missed it, I would hope that you would keep an eye on it and make sure to not miss any more. Zeros drag down easily. It's very hard to build something that's already crumbled. So please keep an eye on that. Today's lecture is going to go short if the review is a lot better than the last one, because we're just finishing up theater diversity. But the last time I said, hey, we'll be here for just a little bit, we ended up being here for almost 25 minutes longer because of the amount of people who just sat and stared. So first thing, armbands up. All right. Pull the mask up. The fact is, folks, a mask under your nose is like a plumber's crack showing. Nobody wants to see it right now. And so get it up. That said, we covered 2 groups in the last class, and we covered quite a few major figures. And so today I'm hoping we can actually move on some of those. Who is this? Lorraine Hansberry. What is she known for? A raisin in the sun. Why is that important? What? Well, yes, it's the only play we've got by her that she completed. She had started other projects. Why is it the only thing she did? She died young, breast cancer, at a time where just cutting away was the only, cure for anything with cancer. And so, what makes A Raisin in the Sun important in the theater? First play written by an African American to appear on Broadway. As I showed last time, there are multiple versions of this. If you have not ever witnessed it, I've seen multiple films of it. I've seen it in person. It is definitely one of those plays that hits. Lorraine Hansberry did write one of the great American plays. I talked about a lot of why she's not regarded as a great American playwright, because there's no body of work. But even though there's no body of work, no one can deny what she did produce. Now, another individual we talked about is in this photo. Who? Person in the middle. Who? Lloyd Richards. Who is Lloyd Richards? First black director on Broadway. First black director on Broadway in the modern era. And so Lloyd Richards was the director of A Raisin in the Sun. He's actually going to go on, and he is going to direct nearly every premiere of August Wilson plays. Why is August Wilson important? Yes, he did win 2 Pulitzers for Fences and the piano lesson. His first victory was for Fences. In the last 5 years, it was made into a film with Denzel Washington. But what distinguishes him? He's got 2 Pulitzers. Those 2 plays are part of what? The Pittsburgh Cycle, also called the Century Series. And in the words of August Wilson, it was called the Master College. 10 plays, each one taking place in a decade of the 20th century. Each decade, each play representing the black experience in America. It was an incredible undertaking. He did complete it. His last play came out the year he died. And he spent well over 20 years trying to complete this. It was a Herculean effort, but he did get it done. And so those 10 plays and the decades they took place in. Many people consider Fences to be the finest of the 10. The first one he wrote in there is, the first one actually to win the Pulitzer in there is considered to be his finest work out of all of them. So, who is this individual? Ira Aldridge. And why is he important? I know it's a three-person conversation going on today. I've got 2 people trying to get us out of here. He is easily the most important black American actor in the 19th century. And he was known for his Shakespeare performances. He was not celebrated in the United States. The continent that did cherish him was what? The United Kingdom, Europe, England, Great Britain. We could go on and on over their identities. And he was also cherished in Russia, Eastern Europe, Poland. He was a very big name for a long time. He is still recognized as one of the finest Shakespearean actors of his day. And we should acknowledge so. Outside of black and African American theater, we talked about what other form of theater? What other group? Chicano. What is Chicano? People of Mexican descent born in the United States. They are not first generation. Their parents were not immigrants. They were already in California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, before they were even states. And so that's what makes them Chicanos. If somebody comes over from Mexico, they're generally a Mexican. Their parents were Mexican, but Chicanos have been here for as long as any group that sailed over from Europe. And so he is known as the father of Chicano theater. Who is he? Luis Valdez. Luis Valdez is the father of Chicano theater. There are 2 things he did that are significant that we should know. He wrote the first play by a Hispanic or a Latino to appear on Broadway. What year was that? What year was A Raisin in the Sun? 20-year gap between the 2. 1959 for Raisin, 1979 for Zoot Suit. The other key to his history, El Teatro Campencio, a theater company founded by him and others, which actually operated under the United Farm Workers, doing performance for migrant labor. And so it was a highly organized effort. Now, the reason he got involved in that, he began his career with who? Cesar Chavez is actually the head of the United Farm Workers. He was their founder. You didn't start with him. He migrated over to him. Where did he get his start? San Francisco Mime Troupe, which is the oldest continually active political theater in the United States. They have been putting on political plays since the 1950s. What had Valdez leave is that they began engaging in more nationalistic themes, civil rights in the South, the anti-Vietnam War. They were going after big subjects. He wanted to continue addressing the local issues, which is what the mime troupe began with. And so he breaks off with others and forms El Teatro Campesino. It basically translates to the workers' theater. The workers' theater. What was Zoot Suit about? The Zoot Suit riots of the 1940s. Army mobilization in which Chicanos found themselves as minorities in their own neighborhoods. It was not pretty. Who is this individual? Amiri Baraka. Amiri Baraka. Unlike others on this list, Amiri Baraka is not writing really commercial work. A Raisin in the Sun ran on Broadway for nearly 2 years. It shocked everybody. It was a crossover success. People came to the theater who generally did not go to a Broadway show, and people who did go to Broadway shows but basically stuck it out with musicals started going to it also. It was very impactful. Baraka's work doesn't go to Broadway. Baraka's work is being shown in like the Harlem Renaissance Theater. It's being shown in Watts in Los Angeles or the south side of Chicago. And so he adopted a theme from W.E.B. Du Bois. And that theme was by us, about us, and for us. He is not trying to reach out to other communities. He is trying to create work for the community he feels has been deprived. And so he is trying to create a black theater for black audiences. What is considered his masterwork? The Dutchman. Thank you over there, The Dutchman, which does occur on a subway. I'll give you that. Yes, you did. Right behind the guy over there. Yes, you did. Pomalo. And so, Amiri Baraka. And that leaves us with Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson is the most important black actor of the first half of the 20th century. Many people would argue that in the second half it was Sidney Poitier, who was the original Walter Lee in A Raisin in the Sun. But Paul Robeson appeared in what groundbreaking American musical? Showboat. In fact, he had the key song in the entire show. If you go Google Old Man River, he's probably going to be the person who comes up to sing it for you, because it was that iconic. It is still probably the first search result just by the title of the song. Paul Robeson, the biggest reason that nobody knows his name today is that his career was derailed because of his activism. What was he, actively campaigning against? He was involved in the civil rights movement. He was protesting segregation. What caught the attention of the U.S. government? He was speaking out against the United States while on tour in other countries. It was one thing to badmouth us in this country where people would ignore it. It's another thing to badmouth us in countries where you are cherished and it makes headlines. And so what did the U.S. government do to him? They took away his passport to try depriving him of going places. Man spent years battling in the Supreme Court, finally decided that a U.S. citizen's right to free speech does not end just because they're out of the country. They are still a U.S. citizen, and so after years of battling, he did get his passport back. But a lot of his career was derailed in those battles. And so as a result, he's more of a footnote, unfortunately, where he should be on the forefront. There are two more groups that we are going to cover today, and one of which makes up half the population in the world today. I know. How can that be a minority group? You know, this is theater diversity, so what group am I talking about? Should have brought a lawn chair. Half the world's population. In fact, about 51%. What? No. In fact, I would argue that Asians make up the majority of the world's population. I could tell. What? Nope. It's not built upon race. It's not built upon religion. Women. Women. Women are considered to be, for the most part, a minority theater. And this goes for a lot of things in society. One of my favorite things I point out with my majors when we get to Introduction to Theater, which is a majors class in which we read a bunch of plays, is that when you start in the theater, the majority of people you're going to start with are women. And you're going to be around, just classrooms full of women as you start in theater. And so for every guy, there's like 7 women in a class. And when you start off and go into like a community theater or a youth theater, it's the same thing. However, the longer you're in theater and the further you move up hierarchies, such as when you start to run into theater directors, producers, designers, there are less and less women who are in the decision-making part of the process. And that goes with all arts. I would argue it goes with all society. The United States has existed for over 200 years, but only 4 women have ever been on a presidential ticket. That, by being a ticket, it counts both president and vice president. With every 4 years there being an election in 200 years, that's a lot of elections where it doesn't happen. If we take a look at the Oscars, which are considered the big award in the film industry, not only for this country but for the world, only 1 woman has ever won Best Director. And I'm fairly certain, most people would sit here going, I have no clue who that could be. It's Catherine Bigelow. Now you sit there going, what, this must have been in the 30s. No, it was about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more. She won for Hurt Locker, which is a story about, soldiers in Iraq. I can count the amount of female, film directors who have had big hits and won awards, and I'm not going to have to go past my fingers. That's just it. And when, the Oscar committee voted last year to include more women in the voting process, it was because 4/5 of those who had votes to decide who was going to get nominated were men. The Pulitzer, it's existed for just over 90 years now, and for the first 70 years there were 7 women who won. It's not until we hit around 95 that women start to finally make gains in it. And so when you take a look at the entire thing now, you have about, 15, 16 women who have won in 90 years. And the majority of that has come in the last 15 years, last 20 years. And so in society at large, women become a minority. Not in the sense of population, but in the sense of power, in the sense of decision making. And this, Britain has had prime ministers way before we were a country, but they've only had 2 women be prime ministers. That's it. And I can spit out the statistic again and again and again and again. Australia, 1 woman has sat as prime minister. And so when we cross over into the arts, what makes this a great painting? Well, one of the reasons is most of the curators of museums are men. Most of the work they're going to take is, work by men. That's what's hanging in museums. That's what becomes known. That's what's going to become high-priced. And the cycle just continues to perpetuate itself. And so for women to be recognized in any field, not just theater, it takes a lot of muscle and it takes a lot of work. We are going to only talk about 2 women who have had an impact in the theater. One is British, the other one is an American. The Brit is this woman right here. Her name is Caryl Churchill. Caryl Churchill. And since the 1970s, she has written plays that have focused on women's issues. So, before this period, yes, you had female playwrights, and yes, some of them were successful. Crash Course introduces you to Susan Glaspell, and then we've talked about individuals like Aphra Behn. But when you look at the big picture of female playwrights and female parts, they're few and far between because most men who are playwrights write male parts. Tennessee Williams' Streetcar Named Desire is considered to be, one of the great American plays. It has a total of 3 women out of about, a dozen parts. Long Day's Journey into the Night, 2 women. One's a maid, the other's the mother. Death of a Salesman, Arthur Miller's masterpiece. 3 women. 2 are prostitutes, one's the mother. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? 2 women. I could give this number. Shakespeare, whose work is considered our cornerstone. We take a look at Hamlet, 2 women. Take a look at Richard III, 3 women. As You Like It, 2 women. Why is this important? Because Hamlet has nearly 40 characters. Richard III has probably 35 to 40 characters. There's not a lot of women parts being written. And yet, it makes it the majority of the individuals trying to get jobs just not out there. Caryl Churchill, on the other hand, is writing parts for women about their issues. These scenes are from a Churchill play. That play is called Top Girls. It is considered by many to be her finest work. Now, Caryl Churchill is a very, and I mean this, as strongly as possible, a very controversial playwright. As you look at the image, it's fairly obvious that the costumer really had a little bit of everything. And the reason is, the first act in the play, that play is going to occur at a restaurant where they're having a celebration. The woman in the center, here and here, is the protagonist. And she is throwing a party celebrating her promotion in Top Girls Talent Agency. She is being made one of the executives. And so these are all these individuals who are showing up to celebrate with her. Why is it such an odd play? Well, this is a geisha from medieval Japan. This is a female warrior from France, right around the 14th century. This is a Scottish explorer from the 19th century. Over here is whom many people historically refer to as Pope Jane, because it's strongly believed that a woman did become pope. And you get the idea. These individuals come from different time periods, but in each of their time periods, they were considered successful. And so at the dinner, they talk about all the things they did to move ahead for the time period they were in. There were no female explorers. This woman was the geisha to the Emperor of Japan. She actually had as much power as the emperor at times to order people about. Why? Because the emperor listened. The Pope was the center of the universe at one time in Europe. And yet it's believed for a short time a woman sat in that post. You don't hear much about female soldiers from 100 years ago. Yes, some existed. But to go back to the Middle Ages and find some, well, that's really reaching back there. And so as all these women begin to talk about what they had to do to move ahead, one theme emerges. The geisha had 3 children with the emperor and gave every one of them away after she gave birth. Pope Jane, everything fell apart when she became pregnant and became obvious that she was a woman. The Scottish explorer never married. Stayed away from men for the most part. Why? Because if she had gotten married, they would tell her what to do, and they would expect her to be at home and have children. And what you learn from every one of the women in this room is that they had to give up being mothers. One of the great ideas in our country is that we can have it all. I'm going to have the great career. I'm going to have the family. I'm going to have the dog. I'm going to have this. I'm going to have this. I'm going to have this. And what Carol Churchill is pointing out, the most successful women in our history have been childless, and most of them have been divorced or separated from men. And the theme that emerges from this is, for every one of these women to be successful, they had to live like men for the most part. They couldn't get tied down. Does that exist today? Well, when a child is born, legally, the mother's in charge. The father, they put his name on the birth certificate. Well, now he's going to share custody. But there doesn't have to be a father listed on a birth certificate. But the moment a child is born, the mother is in charge. She is responsible legally. And so if she is deemed unfit, everybody's eyes are on her. If she's having issues, everybody's eyes are on her. Men throughout history, if they have a child, well, they get up and walk away, and that can happen. And, in this country, you can go through the courts and everything, but it's not going to be pretty, and you may not get anything out of it. And so every one of these women had to cast aside having it all to be successful. It's kind of like George Bernard Shaw's Miss Warren's profession. When people ask her, why did you become a madam? Why are you running a brothel? You could have done anything. And she's like, what do you mean I could do anything? I can't own property legally. I can't, work in a bank. I can't be a lawyer. I can't run for office. I can't do any of these things because I'm a woman. What other profession is available to me where I can make as much money as a man? So that's the first act in the play, and it's a very technical act. There's overlapping dialogue throughout it. We get to the second act, and the protagonist goes to visit her sister. And as they're having a conversation, the sister's daughter comes in, and she's brought presents for her niece and everything, and the niece goes out. And what we discover in the play is that it's not actually her niece. The protagonist had a baby, and the protagonist gave it to her sister. Why? Because she wanted to be successful. And the sister's asking her, are we ever going to tell her? And she basically says, no. She's happy. You're happy. I'm happy. Why should we? And that's how the play goes on. She was no different than any of the other women, no matter what time period we looked at. Not an easy play. Now, Carol Churchill, as a playwright, she has had her plays banned in Israel. She wrote a play called 7 Palestinian Children, which was highly controversial, and the Israeli government looked at it and said, you're basically trying to attack us. She was part of a movement called In Your Face Theater. In, and then your is a British slang. It's just spelled Y-E-R, Your Face Theater. basically a type of political theater in which it's highly confrontational. She writes plays to provoke. She is kind of like Amiri Baraka. She is not writing plays for people to sit down and say, well, that was a great evening. She's writing plays for people to walk out of the theater and go, man, we're horrible. What did we do to deserve this? And so that is what's made her mark. She is still alive. She is still creating. Her plays, though, like one of her plays concerns the Salem witch trials. Why? Because who were they executing in Salem? A couple of men and a whole lot of women. During the purges that they had over in Europe during their great witch hunt times, it's estimated that nearly 100,000 women were probably burned at the stake. Why? Because men had the power. And women were seen as seductive and evil. Even when we go back to Genesis, who was responsible for the fall? And so Carol Churchill's an individual who writes plays basically saying, hey, don't blame us. We're not in the power to make these decisions. You screwed up the world. And that's what her theater is basically spelling out. To be successful, you've got to do what the others are doing. The other individual I want you to know is Paula Vogel. What I want you to know about Paula Vogel is she's the American on the list. And she is, I would say, the person who opened the floodgates that allowed more women to win the Pulitzer. She won in 1995 for How I Learned to Drive. This was the sort of play that made people highly uncomfortable. The protagonist in this play is an individual who has been molested by their uncle for over 7 years. And now they're coming to terms with what has happened to him. It is not an easy play. And when she won the Pulitzer, one of the things she pointed out is that how it was a rarity for her to get it. And it's a rarity for plays written by women to make it to Broadway. And it's a rarity for women to win the big awards on Broadway. And a lot of people looked around and got uncomfortable because when you look at the statistics, she was right. And so it's after she won in 95, we start to have more women start winning the awards and start picking up a lot more recognition. She is also still alive. In fact, one of her plays won the Tony for Best Direction just in the last 5 years. It was called Indecent. And it was about a play that premiered in New York. And the play was called Wrath of God. And at the end of its first performance, the police went up there and arrested all the actors for indecency. It was the first play in, this is, in the 1930s that actually featured a same-sex kiss on stage. And so they arrested everybody. People went nuts over it. And so the playwright and the actors all left America for Europe. They continued performing the play. And unfortunately, they were all exterminated in the Holocaust. It's one of those tidbits of theater history that gets lost, unfortunately, but Indecent was a major work. But still to this day, How I Learned to Drive is her monument play that started to change things. The next group that we're going to talk about has made significant contributions to the theater. And this group is not a gender, it's not a race, it's not a religion. But this group has been persecuted perhaps more than any other group in the history of the world. Lawrence versus Texas was a major decision in this group's favor. Tennessee Williams, Edward Albee were members of it. Oscar Wilde. Terrence McNeely, Tony Kushner. the actor Nathan Lane, Rock Hudson, gay and lesbian, the gay and lesbian community. Lawrence versus Texas was 2004. What did it? 2004. What did it establish? That you couldn't arrest a gay couple for having sex. That's how long before they finally decriminalized it. In Texas, a neighbor was having problems with his gay neighbor, and so he decided to call the cops saying that they had a gun. When he heard noise next door, knowing that they were having sex, and so the police broke in, found two guys having sex, and arrested them. And so that case went all the way to the Supreme Court. It was Lawrence versus Kansas, and the Supreme Court ruled no. Two consenting adults can do whatever they want if they're not bothering anybody and they're in their own home. This was, an illegal arrest, basically, and they threw the case out. The neighbor was arrested for filing a false report. Oscar Wilde, remember, was in prison for nearly 2 years. In Britain, it was called gross indecency. And in fact, when we make it up to the 1940s, 50s, and even 60s, castration was used as a form of control for it. And, this has existed in nearly every culture. Catholicism, they've been down on it since the Middle Ages. It was an offense that could lead to execution. Islam, it doesn't go over well. Orthodox Judaism, it's not going to be happening. It is a group, because of their sexuality, become a minority. In the United States, this finally got to the forefront in the 1960s. In 1967, we had an event called the Stonewall Riots. The Stonewall Inn was a gay bar in New York. One of the things that occurred throughout the country, from New Orleans to Los Angeles to New York, is that when police statistics were suffering, they would raid a gay bar. And so if it looked like, oh my God, there's been 10 burglaries and we haven't made an arrest, we got to show that we're doing something, they would raid a gay bar, arrest 10 to 15 people, and then they would turn around and publish, police make 10 to 15 arrests, and people were like, that's going to stop those burglaries, they're arresting people. And so it looked good statistically, but it had nothing to do with what was going on in the world. And this occurred all the time. Well, with this happening for years, finally, in 67, there was a raid on the Stonewall Inn, and unlike every other time, a riot broke out. Because the people in the inn decided they weren't going anywhere. This was their place. And so the Stonewall Inn riots broke out. It's kind of funny because of this triangularization of the streets. They ended up chasing the cops, and the cops were freaking out. Why? Because as they went around the circle, the groups broke in two, and they thought there were like thousands of people after them, when it was, basically a few hundred started to gather. The riots lasted a few weeks. When this event ended, the police stopped raiding bars. This became something in the past. Today, the Stonewall Inn is actually a National Historic Site. It's basically a national park. And so it is seen as basically the starting point of the gay rights movement. And so as this is the starting point, things are going to begin to evolve after it. And so 1 year after, we find ourselves with The Boys in the Band. The Boys in the Band. This is from the original film version, and this is the original cast for the Broadway production, off-Broadway production. And this is the edition that came out within the last 5 years, 2018. The 50th anniversary is when it finally got its Broadway premiere. But it opened up in 1968 off-Broadway. It was the first openly gay show to appear on Broadway. It ran for over 100 performances, which was groundbreaking for the time. In 1968, this was still a subject people did not engage in. If you had a gay relative, that was your aunt with her roommate. And nobody went to visit for the most part. That was your uncle and his best friend who were sharing a place because they didn't make enough money. Every family had an excuse, some way to guard it. In Tennessee Williams's plays, he was battling it all his life of who he was, and so almost every gay character he wrote ends up dead at the end. It's just the way it breaks. And for the most part, the Hays Code banned homosexuality from ever appearing anywhere in a film, and this is not going to really start changing until the 1970s in film. And when they did appear, they were something to be pitied, or they were the villain. And they remained the villain all the way through the 90s, I would argue. It was just the way things were being created at the time. By the way, this cast is actually made a film version, and that's going to be released soon. This play was by Mort Crowley. Mort Crowley. It was his first play, and it was groundbreaking for the time period it came out. Today, it is actually condemned in most of the homosexual, gay, and lesbian communities. Why? Because they say it stereotypes too many things. But at the time it came out, it was cutting edge. In the play, your protagonist, Michael, he's throwing a party. They're having a birthday party for their buddy. And when people are, during the day, they go to work and everything, nobody's gay. They're hanging out at the office and everything. It's not until the evening when they're with their loved ones, their friends and stuff, that they reveal who they actually are. So this party is full of gay men. They're talking about, how's work and everything else. And all of a sudden, Michael gets a phone call. It's a friend from college who's freaking out and saying, listen, I'm in town right now. I've got to see you. I know it's been years. I've got to talk to you. It's about me and Karen. And so Michael's like, can I see you tomorrow? We're having a birthday party right now. I'm having some friends over. Can I see you tomorrow? And he's like, I need to see you tonight. And he hangs up and he goes there. And Michael looks at all his friends and says, listen, I haven't seen this guy in years. He doesn't know. When he gets here, I need us all to act straight. And there's a great character, Emery, in the show who looks at him and says, what do you want us to do? Talk about the Giants? And so, his friend shows up, Alan, and Alan starts to look around and starts getting really uncomfortable with these guys who are all really uncomfortable. And as the play progresses, it becomes a highly uncomfortable play for the audience because you see people who can't be who they are. And it's an incredibly depressing play. And at the end of the play, Michael goes to Mass, a midnight Mass at a church. Why? Because his entire life he's been looking for forgiveness for who he is. Powerful play. I understand why some people condemn it today, but at that time period, it was definitely something we needed. Another key individual at this time is Charles Ludlam. Charles Ludlam. Charles Ludlam was trying to do for the gay and lesbian community what Amiri Baraka was trying to do in the black community. What was that? He was trying to create a theater by homosexuals, for homosexuals, about homosexuals. Because, like I said, if you went to the movies, what did you see? You saw pity or you saw villains. If you went to the theater and saw Tennessee Williams, you saw somebody who was going to commit suicide. Lillian Hellman's Little Foxes. Person gets institutionalized at the end. Why? Because it was a disease. The American Psychiatric Association deemed it that way all the way to the 60s. So Charles Ludlam in San Francisco starts the Ridiculous Theater Company. And the Ridiculous Theater Company is a company that does shows that are geared toward a gay and lesbian audience. It's addressing themes within their community. And it was actually very important for that time period. And so, if we've got the playwright with Mort Crowley, here we have the producer and director, somebody actually putting this stuff up on stage that an audience is starved for, because when they go to mass entertainment, anything that represents them is not very good as far as, hey, this is who we are. The last individual I'm going to ask you to know is considered by many people to be the most important playwright in America in the second half of the 20th century. And he is still alive today, and he has written a lot of work that's considered very important. And just as August Wilson, probably within the next generation, will be deemed up there with Eugene O'Neill and Arthur Miller, so will this individual, Tony Kushner. Tony Kushner. Tony Kushner is gay, but he is not writing plays solely for a gay audience. Many of his plays don't have any gay characters, but what is considered his most important does, and that play is Angels in America. Angels in America is his play with the big impact. Now, here's some information about why this play is so meaningful. It came out in the 1990s. It takes place in the 1980s. You have grown up in a world where AIDS is not the boogeyman. It's bad. There's no cure, no vaccine. But when it came out in the, started making headlines in the 80s, people were suffering with it in the 70s, but they didn't really have AIDS as an answer for it. In fact, in the 70s, it was believed that only homosexuals could get it. It was known as a gay disease. It was known as gay cancer. In fact, the clinical name for it was GRID, gay remission immune disease. It wasn't until people started looking around and saying, a lot of straight people dying of this thing, that people started finally noticing. Because it was associated with homosexuality, and because it was seen as this horrible disease that could only affect them, a lot of people got it, wouldn't talk about it. Why? Because, oh my God, I got AIDS, but I'm not gay, but nobody's going to believe it because I've got AIDS. And so it became this big disease that people would hide all the time. Unfurled on the Washington Mall were AIDS quilts that had little panels with individuals who had died of the disease. And it was a horrific disease. Today, a lot of medications we have that came out for it do an excellent job. Unfortunately, in the 1980s, where this play takes place, this isn't what the play is about. The play is about the politics. The play is about the brokenness of a system. The play is about what happens to individuals in this disease. One of the interesting things about our current pandemic is that Anthony Fauci, the leading expert that we turn to right now, was actually hired originally to begin work against AIDS. That's what he was brought in for during the Reagan administration. And when it came out, a lot of people said, oh, we'll have a vaccine in 2 years. Well, that has never happened. We continue to research. We continue to put money into it. AIDS is probably the biggest killer they have in Africa today. It's probably the second biggest killer in Asia. It is just a horrific disease that continues to spread. And when we take a look at what was occurring during the time where there was no medications, most people died at like 1/4 or 1/5 their weight. It just shriveled you up to nothing as your immune system failed and everything fell apart. So what is this play about? Well, there is a character who has AIDS. And as a result, the people who love him don't want to be around him. In the hospital, nurses and doctors refuse to go in the room. Why? Because, nobody fully knows how it spreads. You're basically left on your own. The government doesn't fund research on it for the most part. Why? Because it's considered a gay disease. It's not affecting the majority, and so it's underfunded. There are other things that we can research, no matter how horrific it is. The funding really doesn't start to increase until lots of straight individuals start to get it. It's a very complicated play about the politics. It's a play in which there are 4 protagonists. That is not normal to carry that many protagonists in a show. And the title itself is because at the end of the play, it's called Millennium Approaches, because we're getting near the year 2000. And at the very end of the play, there's a lot of noise and everything else, and crashing through the ceiling comes an angel. He says, "Greetings, prophet, the great work begins." And there's a second part to the play, Angels in America Part 2, Perestroika. If you watch both plays back to back, it's 7 hours of theater. And I have taken a group to see both plays performed in the same day. One started at 2 o'clock, we went to dinner, we came back, and we watched the second part past midnight. And we were not in a good mood getting back, because it is not the happiest of plays, as you can imagine. Now, I said Tony Kushner was a gay individual, but he is not writing about gay themes. In fact, he's an individual who has been on the screenplay writing for quite a while. Steven Spielberg turns to him a lot. Both of these screenplays were by Tony Kushner. Both are Spielberg films. In fact, August Wilson had died in 2004 when they made Fences just a few years ago. They had to adapt it for the screen, and they called in Tony Kushner, who said he would do it only if he did not receive any credit, because he didn't want his name associated with August Wilson, because he said, "This is August's work, not mine. I'm just transforming a few things. I shouldn't get credit for what he did." And so he is constantly called in to work with things. And so Tony Kushner, Angels in America, Ludlum, The Ridiculous Theater Company, Mort Crowley, 1968, The Boys in the Band. And if you pay attention to those dates, 1959, 1968, 1979. About every 10 years, there's going to be a major movement in the theater, which is going to change the identity of it for a long time. All right, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you to the small handful of people who, answered a lot of questions to try getting us out of here at a halfway reasonable time.